Let's talk about Uniform Resource Locator, also known as URL, in this video. URL is used to locate a resource in the web. If you want to locate any resource, it could be like information or action that you could perform, like sending an email, or it could even be tools that you can use, for example, salary calculator and things like that. Any of those resources can be located using the Uniform Resource Locator. Okay, so this URL is a type of URI. What is URI? URI is Uniform Resource Identifier. So this Uniform Resource Identifier helps us to identify something uniquely. For example, if you want to identify a computer connected to the internet, then you can use its public IP address. So public IP address is one example for Uniform Resource Identifier. And this URL is basically a type of Uniform Resource Identifier. Basically, we'll be using URL to identify a resource in the web uniquely. Okay, so the structure for URL is made up of many parts, and some of them are optional and others are mandatory. So the structure includes scheme followed by colon //. Then optionally we can include username password. When we specify username password, the username and password has to be separated by colon and it has to end with @ symbol. So this is optional and this is not recommended either because of the security risk it poses. Then we have host. Optionally we can include port. When we include port, the host name and port has to be separated using colon. Then we have path. Path is also optional. But if we have path, then the parts of the path will be separated by /. Then we have query or query string. This is also optional. And finally, we have fragment. Fragment is also optional. If we include fragment, then it has to be prefixed with pound or hash symbol. Now let's look at each of these parts in little bit more detail. The first part, which is a mandatory part, is scheme. The scheme could be HTTP or HTTPS depending on whether we are using secure protocol or not. When we are using secure protocol, the scheme has to be HTTPS, otherwise it will be HTTP. Then we have host. Host is a mandatory part. This includes things like, the domain name, for example, google.com or mail.google.com. So whatever the domain name which points to the server that you are accessing will be your host. Then the optional port, by default, it will be 80 or 443 depending on the scheme. When the scheme is HTTP, then the default port will be 80. When it is HTTPS, then the default port will be 443. But if you want to override this, for example, your web server is listening on a port that is not one of these default ports, then you can specify the port in your URL. But if your web server is listening on a default port, then you don't need to specify the port in your URL. Next, we have path. Path is used to identify a resource within a web server. So if I go back here, we have host. Host is used to identify a web server, and port is used to specify the port on which that web server is listening. Then path is used to identify a resource within that particular web server. For example, if that web server is all about patient information, then we might have one path to retrieve patient information by ID, and we might have another path which allows us to search for the patient. Okay, so that is what a path, and parts of the path are separated by /. So in this case, if you see here, we have patient, which is a resource, and then we are actually trying to retrieve this particular patient, which is the patient ID. So the patient and patient ID are separated by /. Okay. Then we have query. Query is one of the optional part. This is also known as query string. This is used to pass in additional conditions or filters. For example, if you take this patient/search path, if you want to specify what criteria has to be used for searching this patient, then they can be passed as a query string. And query string always start with question mark, and this query string usually takes key value pairs. Key and values are separated by equal sign. And if you have more than one key value pair, then they have to be separated by ampersand symbol. So in this case, we have two key value pairs. One is name and the other one is age, and these two are separated by ampersand symbol. And finally, we have fragment. Fragment is optional part. This is used for in-page navigation. So this is not going to be sent to the server. This is to identify a resource within the page itself. For example, you might have comment section or detail section within the page, and you might provide a link to that section at the top of the page. When user clicks on it, they'll be navigated to that part of the page. They'll still be in the same page, but they'll be sent to that section of the page. That is what fragment allows us to do. Okay, so that at a high level covers the structure of the URL. Hope this is useful. Thank you.